Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has died. His office says he passed away following a brief and sudden illness. In a Truth Social post, President Donald Trump called Graham one of the greatest people and senators he has ever known.
There are moments when the most powerful man on earth cannot hide behind the office he holds, and Sunday, the 12th of July, was one of those mornings for Donald Trump. He moved from one television interview to another, and in every single one of them his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with policy or politics. He was talking about a phone call, a short, ordinary phone call that had taken place less than 24 hours earlier, and that had turned out to be the final conversation he would ever have with a man he called family. That man was Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and by the time the sun came up that Sunday, he was gone. To understand why a president who built his entire public identity on toughness sounded so shaken, you have to go back to the exact hours before the world changed for the people who loved Lindsey Graham. On Saturday evening, sometime around 7 o'clock, Graham called Trump. He had just landed back in Washington after an exhausting international trip, and he wanted to talk about a piece of legislation he had spent more than a year fighting for. His voice, by Trump's own account afterward, sounded like Graham always sounded. Energetic, focused, already 3 steps ahead, chasing the next vote before he had even unpacked his bags. The two men spoke about timing, about strategy, and about getting a major bill across the finish line. Then they said goodbye, the way two men who have talked 1,000 times before say goodbye, with no ceremony and no idea that anything unusual was happening. Neither of them had any reason to believe those would be the last words they exchanged. What haunted Trump when he sat down in front of the cameras the next morning was simple arithmetic, the kind of arithmetic that turns an ordinary Saturday into something no one can ever think about the same way again. He kept doing the math out loud, almost involuntarily. The call had happened in the early evening. Graham had collapsed at his home on Capitol Hill later that same night, which meant that somewhere in the gap between those two facts, a friend Trump had trusted for over a decade had gone from planning his next legislative fight to fighting for his own life. Trump told the American public, in a voice noticeably heavier than his usual delivery, that it could have been his last call, and that he simply did not know for certain. He said the loss felt devastating. He said Graham had felt like family to him, for a man who has spent decades cultivating an image of controlled, unshaken command. The crack in that composure was not subtle, and it was not something viewers could easily unsee. One detail seemed to circle back through everything Trump said that morning, almost like he could not let it go. Graham had sounded tired. That was it. Nothing more dramatic than the tiredness of a 71-year-old man who had just flown across an ocean and back. Trump said that other than being worn out from travel, Graham had seemed completely fine on that call, and it is precisely that ordinariness that makes sudden death like this so difficult for the people left behind to process. There is no warning to point to, no final sign anyone could have caught in time. Trump even offered, almost as if speaking to himself as much as to the cameras, a strange kind of comfort, that maybe going quickly, without a long illness or a long goodbye, is not the cruelest way for a life to end. It was the sound of someone trying to make sense of something senseless, while the entire country listened in. The news itself reached Trump in the middle of the night, relayed through someone connected to Graham's office at around 1 in the morning. And with that message, a relationship that had weathered public insults, political betrayals, and more than a decade of Washington's particular brand of loyalty and grudge was simply over. To understand the size of that loss, though, you first have to understand exactly where Lindsey Graham had been standing less than 2 days earlier, because the distance between that moment and his death is almost impossible to comprehend. Barely more than 24 hours before he died, Graham was in Kyiv, in the middle of an active war zone, and by every account from people who saw him there, he looked more alive than most men half his age. It was his 10th trip into Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began, and the welcome he received reflected years of consistency. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky greeted him personally. Graham toured a drone manufacturing facility, inspecting the kind of long-range interceptor technology that Ukraine had been forced to develop out of necessity, and he told reporters that it would be a serious mistake for the United States not to deepen its cooperation with Ukraine in that exact field. He stood in front of a display of destroyed Russian tanks in central Kyiv and made an announcement he had been chasing for well over a year, that the Trump White House had finally agreed to back his long-stalled sanctions bill targeting the countries funding Russia's war machine by purchasing its oil. He told the assembled press that this meant the legislation was going to become law. He said he had never felt more optimistic that there was a real, workable path to ending the war. He spoke about squeezing Vladimir Putin's economy until continuing the fight became unsustainable, about a moment of genuine opportunity that he believed had finally arrived after years of frustration. In interviews given that same day, he described Putin as a man saying one thing while doing another, pointing to Russia's continued attacks as proof that diplomacy alone would never be enough. This was not a tired elder statesman coasting toward the end of a long career. This was a man at the absolute peak of his influence, surrounded by allies who trusted him completely, having just delivered what he considered one of the signature achievements of his political life. Then he boarded a flight home. He landed in Washington, made his call to Trump about the very legislation he had just secured a breakthrough on. Sounded like a man who had simply had a long few days of travel and went home to his house on Capitol Hill. Nobody around him, and certainly not Graham himself, had any sense that a clock had already started running. The emergency call came in that Saturday night. Paramedics were dispatched to Graham's Capitol Hill home for reports of chest pain, and within a short window, the situation escalated dramatically. What had begun as chest pain became a full cardiac emergency, and the responding crews worked to save him at the scene before he was placed into an ambulance and rushed to George Washington University Hospital. Police vehicles and fire trucks lined the street outside his home that night, a scene captured by at least one neighbor watching from a nearby window. Despite the effort to save him, Graham died that night. He was 71 years old. His office released a brief statement in the early hours of Sunday morning, saying only that the senator had died from what they described as a brief and sudden illness. They asked for prayers for the family and for privacy during what they called an incredibly difficult period. No specific cause was given in that first statement, and that silence, however understandable in the middle of grief, created a vacuum. Later that same day, Graham's office and the District of Columbia Medical Examiner's office released a preliminary finding. The cause of death was an aortic dissection tied to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, essentially a tear in the body's largest artery caused by hardened, weakened blood vessels. It is a condition that can develop silently for years and then kill within hours once it ruptures, offering little to no warning even to the person experiencing it. But in the hours before that clinical explanation reached the public, the absence of detail did exactly what absences of detail always do in the modern information environment. It filled up fast with speculation. Some of the loudest voices online pointed immediately toward Russia, and in some cases toward Iran, suggesting foul play rather than natural causes. The theory found an audience because, on the surface, the timeline seemed almost too dramatic to be coincidence. One of the Senate's most consistently anti-Putin voices, a man who had spent years pushing sanctions and military aid for Ukraine, collapsing within a day of standing inside a war zone announcing fresh pressure on Moscow. Russian officials and state-aligned commentators did little to cool the speculation, with some describing Graham dismissively as a longtime adversary of their country in the hours after his death became public. For law enforcement sources told CNN that, at that stage, there was no indication of anything other than a natural death. Local police conducted the kind of routine review that follows any unexpected death in a private home. When the FBI's director posted publicly that the Bureau was assisting local authorities, it briefly fueled another wave of speculation online, even though officials clarified that this simply reflected standard cooperation rather than evidence of a crime. And underneath all of the noise sat a detail that the loudest theories tended to skip past entirely. Heart disease ran in Graham's family. His own father had died of a heart attack in his late 60s, and the emergency responders who fought to save Graham that night were treating a cardiac event, not a foreign toxin. Sometimes the simplest explanation, the hardest one for people to accept precisely because it offers no villain to blame, turns out to be the true one. That same family history opens a door into a part of Graham's life that most people who only knew him as a senator never fully understood. For all of the tributes, all of the flags lowered to half-staff, all of the statements from world leaders describing him as a friend. The people who lost him hardest were never a wife or children, because Graham never had either. That was not incidental to who he was. It was central to it. When Graham was barely into his 20s, his mother died of cancer. Roughly a year later, his father died of the same heart condition that would eventually claim Graham himself, leaving a young man suddenly responsible for a struggling family liquor store and pool hall, and for a 13-year-old sister with nowhere else to turn. Most people in that position might have looked for the nearest exit. Graham did the opposite. He effectively became his sister's parent. He took on legal responsibility for her and later formally adopted her, so she could receive certain military-connected benefits tied to his own service. And for years afterward, he made the long drives home to hold together what was left of their family, while he built a career in law and eventually in politics. His sister has described him, in terms that land very differently now, as having functioned as brother, father, and mother all at once. When people occasionally pressed him over the decades about why he had never married, Graham tended to deflect with the kind of dry humor that was one of his trademarks, joking that he simply never found the time, and that the right woman had been smart enough not to waste hers on him. Underneath the joke was something much heavier, a life in which nearly all of his capacity for family had already been spent on the sister he refused to let down. That context matters enormously when you consider how many people, across a genuinely wide political spectrum, described losing him as a personal loss and not simply a professional one. It helps explain why a president who has never been shy about political combat could sound, on national television, like a man who had lost a member of his own family. It also helps explain the strange and complicated arc of the relationship between Donald Trump and Lindsey Graham, one of the more unusual friendships in recent American political history. It is worth remembering how openly hostile that relationship once was. Back in 2015, during Trump's first run for the presidency, Graham publicly and repeatedly criticized him in blunt terms, warning that Trump's rise represented a serious danger to the Republican Party and to the country's political culture. After the events at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, Graham stood on the Senate floor and declared, in a moment that seemed final at the time, that he was done, that enough was enough. If those two moments were all you ever saw, you would have assumed these were two men who would never reconcile. And yet Graham went on to become one of Trump's closest and most consistent allies in Washington, someone who defended him publicly when few others in the Republican conference were willing to, and who became a regular golfing companion, joking self-deprecatingly that despite all the rounds they had played together, he had never once managed to beat the president. Graham began describing himself, half jokingly and half seriously, as Trump's compass on foreign policy, a remarkable evolution for a man who had once called him a danger to the party. Trump, for his part, remarked afterward that Graham would likely be appreciated even more now that he was gone than he had been while he was alive, a painfully familiar realization for anyone who has ever lost someone they argued with constantly and loved anyway. That capacity to be both a fierce partisan and a genuine friend across party lines extended well beyond his relationship with Trump. Democrats who had fought him hard for years, including on issues where he never budged an inch, spoke about him with real warmth after his death, describing him as both a tough opponent and a real friend, someone whose word meant something even when you disagreed with him completely. That is an unusually rare thing to earn in a political environment built, more often than not, on permanent grudges. Perhaps the most bitter part of this entire story is what Graham left unfinished on his desk. For more than a year, he had been the driving force behind an aggressive sanctions package aimed squarely at nations helping to fund Russia's war economy, particularly purchasers of Russian oil, gas, and uranium, legislation that had earned the nickname Sanctions from Hell for how punishing its terms could be. He had spent his final trip to Kyiv telling the world that the White House was finally on board, that the bill was going to become law, and that it might genuinely help bring the war closer to an end. He died believing he had won that fight. He did not live long enough to see it actually pass. In the days since, lawmakers from both parties, including Democrats who had worked alongside him for months on the legislation, have described passing that bill as the most fitting tribute they could offer him. There's now real momentum behind the idea that his final major legislative project could become law specifically because of the loss the country just experienced, a strange and bittersweet kind of victory that arrives too late for the one person who wanted it most. If it does pass, it will carry his fingerprints across the closing chapter of a war he spent years trying to help end. Beyond the legislation, there's also the simple, practical shockwave that follows any sudden vacancy of this kind. Graham had just won his Republican primary weeks earlier and was actively preparing to run for another term representing South Carolina, a seat he had held for well over 2 decades, and one that only 2 other people had occupied in nearly 70 years before him. His home state's governor summed up the scale of the loss with a short, direct line, saying simply that South Carolina would not see his likes again. Maybe that is the real truth, sitting underneath everything Trump kept circling back to that Sunday morning, underneath the heavy voice and the replayed phone call and the visible effort to hold himself together on live television. Not a conspiracy, not poison, not some hidden plot orchestrated from Moscow or Tehran. However tempting that explanation might have felt to some in the chaos of that first sleepless night, something far quieter, and in its own way far harder to accept. One of the loudest, most relentlessly active men in American politics went completely silent in the space of a single evening, and the people who loved him, from a grieving sister in South Carolina to a president struggling to find the right words on national television, are still trying to make sense of how a day that began with so much hope in a war zone thousands of miles away could end with sirens on a quiet street in Washington. Do you think there's more to how Lindsey Graham died than what's being reported? Or does the simplest explanation, a body finally failing under decades of strain, feel like the honest one to you? Let us know in the comments.